A ruthless CEO rejected her for being poor, until she became the only one who could save his company. The grand ballroom of Sterling University was alive with laughter and the soft hum of a classical symphony. Beneath the dazzling chandeliers, the elite of the academic world wove through the crowd, sipping on expensive champagne and exchanging polite conversations. Isabella Carter stood near the edge of the room, a delicate glass in her trembling hand, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent years admiring Adrian Sterling from a distance, watching him command every space he entered. He was everything she wasn't: rich, powerful, and effortlessly respected. Yet, beyond the arrogance and cold demeanor, she had glimpsed something else, something she couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was foolishness, but she had always believed that beneath his impenetrable exterior, Adrian had a heart capable of love. And she had dared to hope that heart could belong to her. Tonight was the night she would finally tell him. Taking a deep breath, she wove through the crowd, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Adrian stood near a grand window, overlooking the city skyline, holding a glass of whiskey in his hand. His chiseled features were unreadable, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd with detached amusement. He didn't belong to this world. He owned it. Isabella hesitated, then summoned her courage. "Adrian," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He turned, his gaze landing on her with mild curiosity. "Isabella," he acknowledged, taking a slow sip of his drink. "I didn't expect to see you here." She forced a smile. I just wanted to talk to you. In private." A flicker of impatience crossed his features, but he nodded and led her toward a quieter section of the ballroom. The moment they were alone, her heart pounded harder. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but now that she stood before him, all her carefully prepared words abandoned her. I know this might come as a surprise," she began, trying to steady her voice, "but I've had feelings for you for a long time." She exhaled sharply, willing herself to be brave. "I admire you, Adrian. I always have. And I just thought, maybe you feel something too." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Adrian let out a quiet chuckle, one without warmth. He took another sip of his whiskey before speaking. "You admire me?" he repeated, his voice laced with amusement. "Isabella, you don't even know me." Her face burned, but she pressed on. "I do. I know you're brilliant. I know you've worked hard for everything you have, even with your family's name. And I know that beneath all of this," she gestured vaguely at the glittering room, "you're more than just the businessman people see." Adrian sighed, swirling the liquid in his glass before finally meeting her gaze. "Isabella," he said, his tone firm but emotionless, "you don't belong in my world." Her breath caught in her throat. "What?" He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to explain something obvious. "You're a smart woman, but this," he gestured between them, "was never going to happen. You and I come from different worlds. I don't have time for distractions, and I certainly don't believe in love." Isabella felt as if the floor had been ripped from beneath her feet. "Distractions?" she whispered, the word feeling like an open wound. Adrian's gaze didn't waver. "You deserve to hear the truth. Love is an illusion, Isabella. A luxury for people who have nothing else to offer. I build empires. I don't waste time on fleeting emotions." The air between them grew impossibly heavy. Isabella wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that love wasn't a weakness. But looking at him now, she realized he truly believed it. She had been nothing to him, not even a possibility. Humiliated, she swallowed back the lump in her throat. She had given him her heart, and he had crushed it without a second thought. Forcing herself to stand tall, she straightened her shoulders. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, her voice steady despite the pain cutting through her. "I won't make the mistake of bothering you again." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, her hands trembling at her sides. The moment she stepped outside, the cold night air hit her, but it was nothing compared to the ice that had settled inside her chest. That night, Isabella made a silent vow. She would never allow anyone to make her feel this small again. Adrian Sterling watched her leave without a second glance, draining the rest of his whiskey in one gulp. A part of him had expected her to cry or plead, but she hadn't. She had taken his rejection with more dignity than most. Not that it mattered. He had been raised in a world where love was nothing more than a foolish fantasy. His father had taught him that emotions had no place in business, that power and control were all that mattered. And Adrian had spent his entire life ensuring he never deviated from that lesson. Isabella Carter was smart and ambitious, but she was naive if she thought admiration was enough. As he turned back toward the party, he dismissed the encounter from his mind. He had more important things to focus on. Sterling Enterprises was expanding, and he had no time for unnecessary distractions. Months passed, and Isabella left everything behind. She packed her bags, withdrew the little savings she had, and moved to a city where no one knew her name. If Adrian Sterling thought she didn't belong in his world, she would prove him wrong. She started from the bottom, taking a job as a low-level assistant at a small business firm. The work was grueling, the hours long, but she refused to give up. She studied, learned, and absorbed everything about the industry, determined to build something of her own. Every sleepless night, every hurdle she faced only fueled her determination. She had once thought love was her greatest dream, but now her only dream was to succeed. Meanwhile, Adrian's empire flourished. Sterling Enterprises dominated the market, acquiring smaller businesses and expanding into new industries. His name was synonymous with power, and he relished the control he held over the business world. But behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. Cracks had begun to form in Sterling Enterprises. Minor financial discrepancies, questionable investments, and an increasing number of competitors. Adrian ignored the warning signs, convinced that his empire was untouchable. Yet, fate had a way of humbling even the most powerful. And soon, Adrian Sterling would learn that some battles couldn't be fought with wealth alone. The city skyline stretched endlessly before Adrian Sterling as he sat in his high-rise office, a whiskey glass resting in his hand. The world below bustled with life, but none of it mattered to him. He had built an empire, just as he had always planned, and yet something gnawed at the edges of his mind, an unease he couldn't shake. It started as whispers in board meetings, murmurs among his financial advisors, a dip in stocks, minor fluctuations in investments. He dismissed them at first, but then came the reports, failed acquisitions, bad investments, and, worst of all, competitors rising in the shadows. For the first time in years, Sterling Enterprises was vulnerable. Adrian refused to panic. He had faced challenges before, and he had always emerged stronger. Yet, as he pored over financial statements deep into the night, the numbers refused to lie. Something was wrong. His father had once told him that empires weren't built on emotions, but on strategy and control. Adrian had followed that advice his entire life, ensuring nothing and no one could shake his foundation. But what if the cracks had already formed beneath him? He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair, ignoring the ache behind his eyes from the lack of sleep. There had to be a way to turn things around. He just had to find it before the world realized he was bleeding. As Adrian fought to maintain his control, another empire was quietly rising. Isabella Carter had spent the last few years in relentless pursuit of success. What had once been a dream fueled by heartbreak had become something far greater. She no longer sought to prove herself to Adrian or anyone else. She was building something for herself. Her journey had been grueling. Late nights, failures, and setbacks had tested her resolve, but she had refused to break. She had learned from the best, studied every deal, every market shift, and slowly, she had carved her place in the business world. She was no longer the naive girl who had once looked at Adrian Sterling as if he held the universe in his hands. Now, she stood among the elite, her own name carrying weight in boardrooms and negotiations. And it was through that power that she heard the whispers. Sterling Enterprises was faltering. At first, she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph. The past felt like a distant memory, one she had buried beneath years of hard work. But as reports continued to flood in, she realized something important. This was an opportunity. A lifetime ago, Adrian had dismissed her as insignificant. But now, their worlds were about to collide once more. And this time, she would not be the one left behind. Adrian tightened his tie as he stepped into the conference room, his expression unreadable. His executives sat in tense silence, waiting for him to speak. "We need solutions," he said, his voice sharp. "Not reports about what's going wrong. I want strategies." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one of them cleared his throat. "Sir, there's been an offer." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "An offer? A merger?" He scoffed. "I don't merge. I acquire. This is different." A file was slid across the table toward him. Adrian opened it, his gaze darkening as he read the details. It was a business proposition, one that would stabilize Sterling Enterprises, securing its future. But as his eyes flicked to the bottom of the page, his entire body went still. The proposal had one name attached to it: Isabella Carter. A slow, bitter smirk tugged at his lips. Of course. He closed the file with deliberate precision, resting his hands on the polished surface of the table. Set up a meeting. The air in the restaurant was thick with tension when Adrian finally saw her again. Isabella sat at the head of the table, poised, confident, and utterly in control. Gone was the hopeful young woman who had once looked at him with admiration. The woman before him was sharp, polished, and entirely unshaken by his presence. "Adrian," she greeted smoothly, lifting her wine glass. "It's been a long time." He took his seat across from her, studying her carefully. She had changed, but so had he. "I see you've done well for yourself," he said. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Some of us had no other choice." He leaned back in his chair, letting the moment stretch between them. "A merger? That's bold, even for you." She tilted her head. "Business is about opportunity. And right now, I have the upper hand. Sterling Enterprises is struggling, Adrian. You need me." The words stung more than he cared to admit. He had once dismissed her as irrelevant. Now, she sat across from him as his equal, or worse, his savior. He exhaled, steepling his fingers. "And what do you want in return?" She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing her answer. Then, with a small, knowing smile, she set down her glass. "Everything." He chuckled, shaking his head, still as ambitious as ever. Her gaze hardened. "I learned from the best." Adrian knew what this was. She wasn't just here for business. This was about power, about proving that she was no longer the girl he had once discarded. And as much as he hated to admit it, she had succeeded. He could refuse, walk away, and find another way to save his empire. But as he looked at her, he realized something unsettling. For the first time in his life, Adrian Sterling had met his match, and he wasn't sure if he was about to reclaim his throne or lose everything to the woman he had once pushed away. The contract was finalized within weeks. Sterling Enterprises and Isabella's company merged under a new entity, with both of them holding equal power. Boardrooms filled with whispered speculations. Was it a partnership or a battle for control? Adrian and Isabella stood side by side, shaking hands for the press. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment history changed. But behind closed doors, the war had only just begun. Adrian watched her carefully, studying her every move. She was brilliant, strategic, and ruthless when she needed to be. And every time he thought he had the upper hand, she proved otherwise. Late nights turned into tense debates. Meetings became battles of wit and power. And through it all, Adrian found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain. He had once told her that love was a distraction. But now, as he watched Isabella hold her own against him, he wasn't so sure. Maybe love wasn't a weakness. Maybe, just maybe, it was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The city was unforgiving, a battlefield where only the strongest survived. Isabella Carter knew this better than anyone. When she left her old life behind, she had nothing, no wealth, no powerful connections, just a stubborn determination that refused to let her fall. The world of business was ruthless, especially for someone like her, a woman with no name, no backing, and no safety net. She started at the bottom, working for a small firm where no one cared about her ambitions. The pay was barely enough to cover rent, and the long hours drained her, but she pushed forward. Every night, she studied financial reports, market trends, negotiation tactics. She absorbed knowledge like a sponge, knowing that intelligence and strategy were her only weapons. Failure came often. Deals slipped through her fingers. Colleagues took credit for her work, and competitors dismissed her. But each setback only fueled her fire. She learned to navigate the game, understanding that trust was a luxury and survival meant being one step ahead. The rejections, the betrayals, the struggles, they became lessons, sharpening her into something unstoppable. Years passed, and the Isabella Carter of the past faded away. In her place stood a woman who commanded attention the moment she entered a room. She had become a master strategist, the person companies called when they were on the brink of collapse. CEOs who once wouldn't have given her a second glance now sought her expertise. One by one, she turned failing businesses into industry giants, earning a reputation as a miracle worker. Success came with power, but unlike before, she no longer craved approval. She had built herself from nothing, and no one could take that away from her. She didn't need validation from the elite or recognition from those who had once dismissed her. She was independent, free, and most importantly, untouchable. But power had a way of drawing in the past, no matter how far one tried to run from it. Miles away, in an office that once symbolized dominance, Adrian Sterling sat in silence. His empire was crumbling, the cracks spreading faster than he could contain them. Sterling Enterprises had once stood untouchable, a beacon of wealth and success. Now it was on the verge of collapse. It had started slowly, minor losses, deals that didn't go as planned. Adrian ignored the warnings, convinced that his legacy was indestructible. His father had built this empire with sheer force, and he had expanded it, strengthening their influence over the years. But arrogance blinded him. A disastrous investment had been the first real blow. A billion-dollar deal that should have cemented his power instead turned into a catastrophic failure. Stock prices plummeted overnight, investors lost faith, and the board of directors began questioning his leadership. Then came the betrayals. Executives he had trusted for years took advantage of the chaos, siphoning money, forging contracts, and leaving destruction in their wake. He had built his empire on control, but now control was slipping from his grasp. For the first time in his life, Adrian Sterling was losing, and he had no idea how to stop it. He sat in the darkened office, his mind racing through possibilities. There had to be a way out, a way to turn this around before everything crashed. He needed someone ruthless, someone brilliant, someone who could fix this mess before it was too late. His advisors scrambled to find the best consultants, bringing him names of industry leaders, but none were good enough. The company needed more than a strategist. It needed a savior. Then, one name kept appearing, over and over again. Isabella Carter. He stared at the report in front of him, the words blurring together. It couldn't be. She had disappeared from his world years ago. He had never given her second thought. And now, she was the one person everyone insisted could save Sterling Enterprises. Adrian clenched his jaw. The irony was almost unbearable. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had built his entire life on the belief that emotions were a weakness, that love was nothing more than an illusion. He had dismissed Isabella without hesitation, never once considering that she could be anything more than a momentary distraction. Now, he had to face a truth more bitter than anything he had ever tasted. She had risen, and he had fallen. And if he wanted to survive, he had to do the one thing he never thought he would. He had to ask her for help. The meeting was set. Adrian had expected hesitation, maybe resistance, but Isabella had agreed almost immediately. That alone unsettled him. He had no idea what to expect when he walked into the conference room where she waited. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. She sat at the head of the table, poised and calm, her expression unreadable. She wore success like armor, sharp, commanding, and completely untouchable. For a moment, he felt like the outsider. "Adrian," she said smoothly, leaning back in her chair, "I was wondering when you'd come." His lips pressed into a thin line. "I assume you've been keeping up with the news." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It's hard not to notice when a giant stumbles. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed. I need your expertise. She tilted her head, feigning curiosity. Is that so? Adrian clenched his fists under the table. This wasn't going to be easy. Sterling Enterprises is in trouble, he admitted. And every expert I've spoken to tells me the same thing. You're the best. You're the only one who can turn this around. Isabella studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stood, walking toward the window. You once told me I didn't belong in your world, she said, her voice quiet but sharp. That love had no place in your life. She turned to face him. Tell me, Adrian, how does it feel to sit on the other side of the table? His jaw tightened. He had expected this. Her anger, her need to make him feel the weight of his past mistakes. But the way she looked at him, without emotion, without even a trace of the girl who had once admired him, it was unsettling. I was wrong, he admitted. A flicker of something crossed her face, but it was gone before he could place it. She stepped closer, placing her hands on the table, leaning in slightly. If I agree to help, it will be on my terms. Adrian forced a smirk. I didn't expect anything less. Her gaze remained steady. You will not question my decisions. You will not undermine me. You will follow my lead. He exhaled, nodding. Fine. She straightened, crossing her arms. And one more thing. He raised an eyebrow. What? She smiled, slow and deliberate. I own 51% of the company. Adrian's breath caught. That's not part of the deal. Her expression remained calm. Then we have nothing to discuss. For the first time in his life, Adrian Sterling knew what it felt like to be powerless. And as he stared at the woman he had once dismissed, he realized she was no longer playing by his rules. Adrian felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, a sensation foreign to a man who had always been in control. He had anticipated resistance, perhaps even a cold reception, but this was something else entirely. Isabella wasn't just negotiating terms. She was seizing power. 51%. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration, a statement that she wasn't here to clean up his mess on his terms. She was here to take what she was owed. Adrian inhaled deeply, suppressing the frustration rising in his throat. That's not an option, he said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Isabella arched an eyebrow, a slow, knowing smile curving her lips. Then neither am I. She moved back to her chair and sat down, crossing one leg over the other as though she had all the time in the world. Her silence was louder than words, her confidence suffocating. Adrian gritted his teeth. He was the one who had come to her, the one who needed her. That alone had been humiliating enough. But to hand over control of the very empire he had spent years building, it was unthinkable. Yet the truth loomed over him like a shadow. He had no other choice. His company was crumbling. The board was already turning against him. Investors were pulling out. If he didn't act now, Sterling Enterprises wouldn't last another 6 months. He exhaled sharply. What you really want, Isabella? She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto his. Power, she said simply. The word sent a chill down his spine. Not because it surprised him, but because for the first time, he realized she had always been capable of this. You have money, he pointed out. Influence, a name that commands respect. You don't need my company. She tilted her head, considering him. No, she admitted. I don't. Adrian's fingers curled into his palm. Then why? Her eyes darkened, just for a moment. Because I can. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Because I can. Adrian had spent years believing emotions were weaknesses, that attachment made people vulnerable. He had dismissed Isabella without a second thought, convinced that she would never be a part of his world. Now, she had built a world bigger than his own, and she was offering him a single chance to survive in it. Or rather, a chance to kneel. The thought sent a fresh wave of resentment through him. But there was no time for pride. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to loosen his grip on the armrest. What are your conditions? Isabella smiled, a quiet victory flashing in her eyes. You sign over 51% to me. His jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. "I will run this company my way," she continued. "No interference. No questions. You follow my lead, or you step aside completely." Adrian fought the urge to protest. "And if I refuse?" She gave him a look that made his stomach tighten. "Then Sterling Enterprises falls." The words were a death sentence. He wanted to argue, to fight, to find a way to turn the negotiation in his favor. But deep down, he already knew. He had lost the moment he walked into this room. This wasn't a deal. It was surrender. And yet, he reached for the pen. As he signed the document, relinquishing the majority of his empire to the woman he had once deemed insignificant, he felt something foreign settle in his chest. Not just frustration, not just anger, fear. Because for the first time in his life, Adrian Sterling wasn't the one in control. And Isabella Carter? She had just taken everything. The shift in power was immediate. Within days, the board of Sterling Enterprises had been restructured. Executives who had once stood loyally by Adrian were removed, their betrayals unearthed and exposed with surgical precision. Investors who had planned to withdraw reconsidered the moment Isabella's name was attached to the company. Adrian watched it all unfold from the sidelines, an outsider in his own empire. Isabella didn't waste time. She was merciless in her approach, tearing through the company's weaknesses with a precision that left no room for argument. She negotiated deals that Adrian had spent months failing to secure. She salvaged failing divisions, eliminated wasteful spending, and rebranded Sterling Enterprises with a vision that left even the most skeptical of investors impressed. The media followed every step. The woman who saved Sterling Enterprises. The rise of Isabella Carter. The strategist who reshaped an empire. Adrian had once dominated these headlines. Now, he was barely a footnote. And yet, despite everything, he couldn't look away. She had become something beyond even his expectations. Strong, unyielding, untouchable. He saw it in the way people spoke to her, the way board members listened when she entered the room. She no longer needed validation. She was the validation. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Late one evening, after another grueling board meeting, Adrian found himself standing outside Isabella's office. He hadn't knocked on this door in years. Now, it felt like enemy territory. He stepped inside without waiting for permission. She was behind her desk, scanning over reports, but she didn't look up. "You've gotten into the habit of walking into my office uninvited," she mused. Adrian leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "I was under the impression I still work here." She smirked, finally lifting her gaze. "That depends." His eyes narrowed. "On." She set the document aside, folding her hands on the desk. "On whether you plan to keep sulking in the shadows, or if you're ready to prove you're worth keeping around." Adrian exhaled, his jaw tightening. "You think I'm useless?" "I think you've spent too long believing power is about control," she said simply. "And now that you've lost it, you don't know what to do with yourself." Her words struck deep. He wanted to argue. He wanted to prove her wrong. But a part of him, the part that had been watching, the part that had seen her accomplish in weeks what he had failed to do in years, knew she wasn't wrong. He had spent his life believing emotions were weaknesses, but what had his cold logic truly given him? A crumbling empire, a tarnished reputation, and the loss of a woman who had once seen something in him that even he had never acknowledged. Adrian took a slow breath. "So what do you suggest?" Isabella studied him for a moment, then stood. She walked around the desk until she was inches away from him, her presence suffocating. "You want to be useful?" she murmured. "Prove to me you can be." Adrian held her gaze, something sharp and unspoken passing between them. This wasn't about business anymore. It never had been. The game had changed. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Sterling wasn't sure if he was playing to win, or if he had already lost. Adrian sat in his office, hands steepled, staring at the door as he waited. He had faced hostile boardrooms, ruthless competitors, and high-stakes negotiations that could make or break entire industries. Yet nothing had ever made him this tense. He had prepared himself to meet Isabella again, to see the woman he had once brushed aside. But he hadn't prepared for what it would feel like when she finally walked through that door. The sharp click of heels on polished marble signaled her arrival before she even stepped inside. When she did, Adrian felt a strange sensation settle in his chest, something foreign, something he didn't have a name for. This wasn't the Isabella he remembered. Gone was the hesitant girl who used to look at him as if he were the sun. In her place stood a woman who radiated confidence, who carried herself with the poise of someone who had conquered mountains and had no intention of slowing down. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She walked into his office like she owned the space because, in many ways, she did. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice smooth and professional, as if he were just another client, just another name on a long list of business dealings. Adrian exhaled slowly, pushing down the strange mix of emotions rising inside him. "Isabella." She set her leather folder on the desk, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. There was no warmth in her gaze, no flicker of the past. He had expected bitterness, maybe even anger, but what he got instead was indifference. And somehow that was worse. "I've gone through the reports," she continued, getting straight to business. "Your company's financial structure is a mess. Your investments are reckless. Your board members are divided, and your public image has taken severe damage." Adrian leaned back in his chair, watching her. "You don't waste time. Time is money," she replied flatly, flipping open the folder. "I've outlined the first steps we need to take. The restructuring process will begin immediately. I'll handle the boardroom conflicts, but you need to prepare for the changes I'm about to make." Adrian smirked, though there was no real amusement behind it. "You're assuming I'll approve these changes." Isabella met his gaze with unshaken confidence. "You hired me because you had no other choice. You and I both know your approval is a formality." A flicker of irritation flashed through him, but it wasn't just frustration. It was something deeper. He was watching a version of Isabella he had never seen before, one who didn't seek his validation, who wasn't waiting for his approval. And it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken history, but Isabella refused to acknowledge it. To her, this was just another job, another deal. But to Adrian, it was something else entirely. She had changed, and he wasn't sure he liked the way that made him feel. Days passed, and the changes came swiftly. Isabella didn't just adjust the company's structure, she overhauled it. She was ruthless, cutting ties with executives who had been leeching off the business for years. She tore through the financial records, exposing every weakness, every flaw. She stepped into meetings with an air of authority that made even the most seasoned businessmen sit up and listen. Adrian watched it all happen, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. He hated it, and yet he couldn't deny the results. Sterling Enterprises, which had been on the verge of collapse, was stabilizing. Investors who had all but abandoned ship were reconsidering. The media, once eager to declare his downfall, were shifting their narrative. And all of it was because of her. Adrian clenched his jaw as he sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports. It wasn't just about business anymore. This was personal. He had underestimated Isabella once. Now, she was proving that she didn't just belong in his world. She was thriving in it. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Before he could respond, Isabella stepped inside, her presence commanding as always. "We need to discuss the upcoming shareholder meeting," she said, placing a folder on his desk. "I've restructured the agenda. You'll follow my lead." Adrian arched an eyebrow. "Is that an order?" She tilted her head slightly, unfazed. "It's a fact." Something inside him bristled. "I built this company, and I'm saving it," she countered without hesitation. The words hit harder than he expected. She was right. He knew it, and that only made it worse. A muscle in his jaw tightened. "You enjoy this, don't you?" "Enjoy what?" she asked, folding her arms. "Having the upper hand." For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not amusement, not triumph, but something deeper. Something unreadable. "I didn't do this to win, Adrian," she said quietly. "I did this because I refused to lose." He didn't respond, because for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to fight her, or if he had already lost in more ways than one. The air between them remained tense, thick with words unspoken. Isabella, ever composed, adjusted the sleeve of her blazer and turned toward the window. From his office, the city stretched before them. Towering skyscrapers, endless streets, the pulse of an empire he had built. An empire that was now hanging by a thread. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the desk. He had spent his entire career being the one in control, the one who dictated the terms. Yet now he found himself answering to her, and it was eating him alive. He studied Isabella as she flipped through the reports, her face unreadable. It was infuriating how effortlessly she had taken charge, how easily she had stepped into his world and made it her own. The woman before him wasn't just competent, she was formidable. And yet, despite the confidence, despite the impenetrable wall she had built, he knew there was something beneath it. He saw it in the way her fingers tightened around her pen when she thought no one was looking. He saw it in the way she avoided meeting his eyes for too long. She had moved on, but something still lingered. "You've been avoiding personal conversations," Adrian said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. Isabella didn't look up. "Because this isn't personal." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "It was never just business between us, Isabella." She finally met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "It is now." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The past stood between them like an unspoken truth neither wanted to address. Adrian knew he had hurt her, knew that his rejection had been more than just a dismissal. It had been a wound. But he had been so consumed with his own world, his own ambitions, that he had never stopped to think about what it had done to her. Until now. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice quieter this time. She arched an eyebrow. "Regret what?" Walking away. There was the slightest pause, just enough to tell him that, for all her strength, for all her resilience, there was still something buried beneath it all. "I regret nothing," she said finally, her voice steady. "Because I didn't walk away, Adrian. You pushed me away." Her words landed with the force of a hammer. He had spent years telling himself that it had been necessary, that cutting ties with her had been the right thing to do. He had convinced himself that emotions had no place in his world. But now, sitting across from her, watching the woman she had become, he wasn't so sure anymore. The days stretched into nights, and their professional partnership continued to flourish despite the lingering tension. Meetings that had once been disorganized and chaotic were now efficient and precise. Executives who had once doubted the company's survival were now cautiously optimistic. And through it all, Isabella remained an unshakable force. Adrian had never admired someone the way he admired her. But admiration came with a cost. It was late when she entered his office again, dropping a thick file onto his desk. He glanced at the time, almost midnight. "You should go home," he said, though he wasn't sure why he even bothered. Isabella had always been relentless when it came to work. "So should you," she replied without looking at him. He smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Since when do you care about my well-being?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before composing herself. "I don't." A lie. She cared once, but she wouldn't allow herself to anymore. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I still don't understand how you got this good." Isabella glanced at him, something flickering in her eyes. "Because I had to." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She leaned against the desk, crossing her arms. "After you shut me out, I had nothing. No connections, no name, no easy path to success. I had to fight for every opportunity. Every step forward came with a dozen setbacks. But I kept pushing, because I refused to let you." She cut herself off, shaking her head. Adrian sat up. "Let me what?" She met his gaze, and this time there was no mask, no guarded walls, just raw honesty. "I refused to let you be the reason I failed." A heavy silence settled between them. Adrian swallowed, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had never considered what it had been like for her after he walked away. He had never thought about the struggle, the pain, the sheer force of what it had taken for her to rise from nothing. But now, as he looked at her, this woman who had conquered the world on her own, he realized something else. She had never needed him. But maybe maybe he had always needed her. Their dynamic had shifted in a way Adrian couldn't quite define. There were still sharp words, still battles for control, but there was also something new beneath the surface. Understanding. One evening, after an exhausting board meeting, he found himself standing beside her in the conference room, both of them staring at the city below. "Your father was brutal," Isabella said suddenly. Adrian stiffened. "What?" She turned to look at him. "I did my research. Sterling Enterprises was built on ruthless ambition, but it wasn't just business. It was personal. Your father raised you to believe that power was the only thing that mattered." His jaw tightened. And that's why you're the way you are," she said simply. "That's why you push people away. Why you never let anyone close. Because weakness wasn't an option for you." He exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table. "You think you have me figured out? I think I understand you more than you want to admit." For once, Adrian had no snide remark, no sharp retort, because she was right, and it scared him. The breaking point came on a night neither of them would forget. A last-minute crisis had thrown the company into turmoil, and tensions had reached their peak. Adrian and Isabella found themselves alone in his office, locked in a heated argument. "You can't control everything, Adrian," Isabella snapped, slamming a report onto his desk. "That's what got you into this mess in the first place." His temper flared. "And you think you know better?" "Yes," she shot back without hesitation. "Because I'm the one fixing your mistakes." The words cut deep. Adrian took a slow breath, his hands clenching at his sides. "Do you hate me, Isabella?" She blinked, taken aback. He took a step closer. "Do you hate me for what I did to you?" Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. "I never hated you," she whispered after a long pause. Adrian let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Then why does it feel like you're still trying to prove something to me?" he asked. Her eyes darkened. "Because for years, you made me feel like I wasn't enough." The confession hung in the air between them. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Sterling, powerful, ruthless, untouchable, felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Regret. He reached for her, hesitated, then dropped his hand. "I was wrong about you." She gave him a sad smile. "I know." They stood there, caught in the weight of everything unsaid. And in that moment, Adrian realized that he might have spent his whole life chasing power, but the only person who had ever truly challenged him was the one standing right in front of him. The silence between them stretched, thick with words neither dared to say. Adrian watched Isabella closely, his mind tangled in contradictions. She was the same girl he had once dismissed, yet she wasn't. The timid uncertainty in her eyes was gone, replaced by unwavering confidence. And yet, beneath it all, he could sense something else, a wound that had never fully healed. Isabella shifted her gaze away first, exhaling softly as if trying to steady herself. "This conversation is pointless," she said. "It changes nothing." Adrian felt something tighten in his chest. "Doesn't it?" Her jaw clenched slightly, but she refused to look at him. "We both have jobs to do, and right now, that's all that matters." He should have let it go, should have accepted that this was how things had to be. But something about the way she avoided his eyes, the way her voice wavered just slightly, made him want to push further. "You built all of this to prove something to me," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization. Isabella turned to him sharply, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I built this for myself." His lips pressed together, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The past clashed violently with the present, an invisible war raging between them. Then, just as quickly as the moment had come, Isabella pulled herself back. She straightened her shoulders and turned toward the door. "I have a meeting in the morning," she said, her voice distant. "Good night, Adrian." And then she was gone, leaving him standing there with 1,000 thoughts running through his mind. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something dangerously close to regret. Days passed, and the tension between them remained unspoken but ever present. Their interactions were professional, their words sharp and efficient. But underneath it all, there was something else, something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Late one evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, Isabella found herself in the boardroom, reviewing reports. The city lights cast a glow through the glass walls, but her focus was elsewhere. She barely noticed when Adrian entered. "You're still here," he said, his voice softer than usual. She didn't look up. "So are you." He hesitated before stepping closer, standing just across the table from her. "You don't have to work this hard, you know. You've already proven yourself." Isabella let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That's where you're wrong, Adrian. People like me don't get the luxury of stopping. If I slow down, someone else will take my place." His eyes searched hers, and for the first time he truly saw her, not just as the woman standing in front of him, but as the girl he had once pushed away. The girl who had been forced to carve her own path without him. "Isabella," he started, but she shook her head. "Don't." There was no anger in her voice, just exhaustion. He hesitated, then slowly took a seat across from her. "At least let me apologize." She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "For what?" "For everything," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, the wall she had built threatened to crumble. But she couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not ever. So instead, she gave him a small, polite smile and turned back to her work. "It's late. You should go home." He wanted to argue, wanted to say something that would break through whatever barrier she had put between them. But instead, he nodded and stood. As he left the room, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he wanted something he couldn't have. The following week was filled with high-stakes meetings and long nights. Isabella remained composed, efficient, and unwavering. But beneath her mask of control, she couldn't ignore the way Adrian's presence unsettled her. It wasn't just that he was different. It was that he was trying. He had always been untouchable, distant, cold, untethered. But now there was something almost human about him, and she didn't know how to deal with that. One evening, after another grueling day, she found herself in the rooftop lounge of the building, seeking a moment of solitude. The city stretched before her, endless and alive. She barely reacted when Adrian stepped out onto the rooftop. "I thought you left," she said, her gaze still fixed on the skyline. He walked over, standing beside her. "I could say the same to you." Silence settled between them, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. After a moment, Adrian sighed. "You were right about me." She turned to him, eyebrows raised. "About what?" He exhaled, looking out at the city. "About why I push you away. Why I never let anyone get too close." Isabella didn't say anything. She just listened. "My father raised me to believe that emotions were weaknesses," he continued. "That vulnerability was a liability. I spent my whole life chasing power because I thought it would make me untouchable." He finally looked at her, and there was something in his eyes she had never seen before. "Regret. But I was wrong," he admitted. "Because when I pushed you away, I didn't become stronger. I just became empty." Her breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to stay composed. "This doesn't change anything," she said quietly. Adrian gave her a small, sad smile. "I know." Another silence. Then, after a long pause, Isabella finally spoke. "You hurt me, Adrian." His expression faltered. "I know, and I don't think I can ever forgive you." He swallowed hard but nodded. "I understand." She turned back to the city. "But that doesn't mean I hate you." Adrian let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. For a long time, they just stood there, two people shaped by pain, regret, and the weight of the past. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Because for the first time, they understood each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Sterling Enterprises was thriving again. Investors who once hesitated were now returning with renewed confidence. Profits soared, and the media began calling it one of the greatest corporate turnarounds in recent years. The company's future, once on the brink of collapse, was now secure. Adrian should have felt victorious. This was everything he had worked for. But as he stood in his office, overlooking the city skyline, a strange emptiness settled over him. He knew exactly who was responsible for this success. Isabella. She had come into his world like a force of nature, tearing through years of stagnation and inefficiency. She had taken a crumbling empire and rebuilt it, not just with strategy, but with precision, discipline, and foresight. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Whispers spread throughout the industry. Rival companies began paying close attention, watching the resurgence of Sterling Enterprises with growing unease. Competitors who had expected the company to fall were now seeing it rise from the ashes, stronger than before. And then there were the enemies within. Adrian had always known that power invited betrayal, but he had underestimated just how close the danger lay. He had built his empire on trust, selecting a handful of people to stand beside him, believing they were as loyal to him as he was to them. But power had a way of changing people. It started subtly. Unusual financial reports, slight discrepancies in budget allocations. Isabella was the first to notice, bringing her concerns to him late one evening. "There's something wrong," she said, placing the reports on his desk. "These numbers don't add up." Adrian frowned, glancing at the pages. "Accounting errors happen." She shook her head. "Not like this. Someone is covering their tracks." His jaw tightened. He knew Isabella wasn't the type to exaggerate. If she was bringing this to him, it meant she had already double-checked her findings. "Who?" he asked. Isabella hesitated. "I don't have proof yet, but I have a strong suspicion." Adrian leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "You think it's someone inside?" She nodded. "Someone with access. Someone you trust." The words settled over him like a weight. "Be careful, Adrian," she warned. The closer the betrayal, the deeper the wound. He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. And for the first time, he felt afraid. The betrayal, when it came, was brutal. It wasn't a competitor or a distant rival. It was someone Adrian had considered family. Nathan Sterling, his father's former business partner, his mentor, his most trusted ally. Nathan had been with him from the beginning, guiding him through his early years in the company, always by his side. And now, the man he had once relied on had orchestrated a silent coup. Legal loopholes, manipulated board members, a smear campaign designed to undermine Adrian's credibility. It was a masterpiece of deception, carefully crafted over months, executed with precision. And Adrian had never seen it coming. The walls of Sterling Enterprises began to crack. Investors who had returned with trust now hesitated again, unsure of who truly controlled the company. Board members, once steadfast in their loyalty, wavered under the weight of Nathan's influence. And in the center of it all stood Adrian, watching everything he had built slip through his fingers. Isabella had seen it coming. She had warned him, urged him to be cautious. But he had ignored her, and now he was paying the price. Late one night, she stormed into his office, slamming a folder onto his desk. "I told you this would happen," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "I told you to be careful." Adrian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had barely slept in days. "I know. You didn't listen." His eyes met hers. "I couldn't believe that Nathan would do this." "Then you were blind," she said, shaking her head. "And now you're about to lose everything." He stood, stepping toward her. "Why do you care?" The question stopped her. For a long moment, she just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, finally she spoke. "Because I know what it's like to have someone betray you," she said softly. "And I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He swallowed hard. "Isabella, But she turned away. "It doesn't matter anymore, Adrian. You have a choice to make. Do you fight for what's yours, or do you let it slip away?" The weight of her words settled over him. And for the first time in his life, Adrian didn't know what to do. Adrian stood frozen in his office long after Isabella had left, her words lingering in the heavy silence. He had spent his life believing he was untouchable, that no one could ever get the best of him. Yet here he was, on the verge of losing everything. The betrayal burned, but what cut even deeper was Isabella's disappointment. She had fought for this company just as hard as he had, maybe even harder, and he had doubted her. Days passed in a blur of legal meetings, urgent phone calls, and heated boardroom arguments. The crisis had reached its peak, and Nathan's plan was unfolding exactly as he had intended. Sterling Enterprises was no longer Adrian's to command. The official notice came on a cold Friday morning. The board had reached a decision, a vote of no confidence. He was to be removed as CEO. He read the document in silence, his fingers tightening around the paper. This wasn't just business. This was personal. Nathan wanted to destroy him, to reduce him to nothing. And he had almost succeeded. Almost. Because Adrian Sterling was not the kind of man to go down without a fight. The news spread like wildfire. The media painted Adrian as a fallen king, once untouchable, now dethroned. His competitors rejoiced, taking advantage of the uncertainty. Investors pulled back, uncertain of what would happen next. But through it all, Isabella watched in silence. She had expected Adrian to crumble, to retreat into his pride and let everything fall apart. But instead, she saw something else. Determination. Adrian wasn't done. Despite everything, he showed up at the office the next morning, walking through the halls with the same confidence he always had. Employees whispered as he passed, uncertain of what was happening. Was he really still fighting? Isabella met him outside the boardroom, arms crossed. "You lost the vote, Adrian. What are you doing here?" His gaze was steady. "Fixing my mistakes." She sighed. "It's too late." "No," he said, stepping closer. "It's not." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a file. "I need your help." She frowned, taking it. "What is this?" "Proof." Isabella flipped through the pages, her eyes widening. "Financial records. Emails. A paper trail leading directly to Nathan." Her heart pounded. "How did you get this?" she whispered. Adrian smirked. "You're not the only one who knows how to find secrets." For the first time in weeks, Isabella felt something other than frustration. She felt hope, but there was still one problem. "This won't be enough," she said, shaking her head. "Nathan has the board in his pocket. Even if we expose him, they won't turn against him unless they see him as a liability." Adrian's expression didn't change. "Then we make him one." The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. Isabella and Adrian worked together, gathering every piece of evidence they could. It was dangerous. Nathan had spent years building his empire of control, and if he suspected what they were doing, he would strike first. But they weren't just fighting back. They were planning his downfall. It started with the investors. Isabella arranged private meetings with the most influential shareholders, showing them the truth about Nathan's dealings. She knew how to speak their language: profit, risk, reputation. Nathan wasn't just a problem. He was a threat. Then came the media, a carefully placed leak, a damning article exposing the corruption inside Sterling Enterprises. Public pressure mounted. And finally, the board. By the time Adrian walked into the emergency board meeting, the tides had already begun to turn. Nathan was waiting, smug as ever, but Adrian saw the first flicker of doubt in his eyes. Adrian took his seat, staring at the men and women who had once voted him out. "I won't waste your time," he said, tossing the file onto the table. "Read it." One by one, they flipped through the pages. Nathan's face paled. "Fabricated," he said quickly. "This is nothing but a desperate attempt to—" Adrian cut him off. "It's over, Nathan." Silence. Then, one by one, the board members turned to Nathan. The power shift was undeniable. In the end, the vote was unanimous. Nathan Sterling was removed from the company. Adrian Sterling was reinstated. The victory should have felt sweet. Instead, all Adrian felt was exhaustion. He sat in his office late that night, staring at the city lights. He had won. He had his company back. But at what cost? A knock at the door. He looked up. Isabella. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "It's done," she said softly. He nodded. "Yeah." Silence stretched between them. "I should be happy," he admitted, running a hand over his face. "But all I can think about is—" She waited. He exhaled, almost lost everything. And not just the company. Isabella didn't move. Then he did something he had never done before. He let his walls down. "I doubted you," he whispered. "When you warned me, when you stood by me, and I pushed you away." She closed her eyes. "Adrian—" "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have trusted you." She opened her mouth, then closed it. For a long time, she had waited to hear those words. But now that they were here, they weren't enough. She took a deep breath. "I can't do this anymore," she said. His stomach dropped. "What?" Isabella looked at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't place. "I spent years proving myself," she said. To this company. To you. He swallowed. I know. And I won, she whispered. But I lost myself along the way. His heart pounded. Isabella. She shook her head. I have to walk away, Adrian. The words hit him like a physical blow. Is it because of me? He asked. She hesitated. Then, finally, she said, It's because of us. She turned to leave. He could have stopped her. But for the first time in his life, Adrian Sterling didn't know what to say. The door closed behind her. And for the first time, Adrian realized that power meant nothing if he had no one to share it with. Adrian sat in his office, staring at the empty chair across from him. Isabella's chair. The place where she had spent hours strategizing, fixing his mistakes, saving his company. Saving him. And now, she was gone. At first, he told himself it didn't matter. He had won. Nathan was out. Sterling Enterprises was his again, and no one could take it from him. But as the days passed, victory fell hollow. The office was colder. The silence stretched longer. The work, once his greatest passion, felt meaningless. Then came the crisis. Without Isabella, the company faltered. The problems she had once handled with ease became impossible to manage. The board was in chaos. Employees grew uncertain, and investors hesitated. The empire he had fought so hard to keep was slipping through his fingers again. Late at night, when the city was quiet and his office was dark, memories of Isabella haunted him. The way she had warned him, fought for him, believed in him, until he made her stop. He had pushed her away, and now he was paying the price. One evening, exhausted and frustrated, he found himself pulling out his phone. His fingers hovered over her name. He wanted to call her, to ask her how to fix this, to ask her if she would ever forgive him. But he didn't. Instead, he made a decision. He wasn't going to just save his company. He was going to win back the woman he lost. The business world buzzed with speculation when invitations went out for the upcoming gala, one of the most prestigious events in the industry. Everyone who mattered would be there, watching. Adrian Sterling's return to the spotlight. He planned every detail carefully. This wasn't just about showing strength. It was about proving something more. The night of the event, Adrian stood on the stage, adjusting the microphone. The crowd quieted as he took a deep breath. This past year, he began, his voice steady but raw, has been one of the most challenging of my life. Murmurs rippled through the room. Everyone knew about the chaos at Sterling Enterprises, but no one expected him to speak about it so openly. I lost control of my company. I was betrayed. I fought my way back. He paused, and in the process, I made the greatest mistake of my life. The room fell completely silent. Across the hall, Isabella stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching. She had almost skipped the event, but curiosity, or something deeper, had pulled her here. Adrian continued, his gaze scanning the crowd. I was blind to the truth. When someone stood by my side, warning me, guiding me, protecting me, I pushed her away. His voice faltered for the first time. She was the reason this company survived. She was the reason I survived. And I was too proud to admit it. Isabella's breath caught. I owe everything to her. Adrian's voice grew stronger. Her intelligence, her strength, her loyalty. Without her, Sterling Enterprises wouldn't be standing here today. And without her, I've come to realize I am nothing. A hushed gasp rippled through the audience. No one had ever seen Adrian Sterling like this, vulnerable, exposed. Somewhere in the crowd, a journalist furiously took notes. A scandal? A love confession? No one knew what to make of it. But Isabella knew. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. Then Adrian did something no one expected. He turned directly toward her. She froze. Their eyes met across the room, and for the first time, she saw something she had never seen before. Not arrogance, not pride, just truth. The moment stretched endlessly. Then he spoke again, softer this time. I was wrong, Isabella. The crowd shifted, turned to look at her. But Isabella didn't move. She barely breathed. He took a deep breath. And if I could go back, I would choose differently. I would choose you. Her heart pounded. The Adrian she had known. The man who cared only for power, who built walls around his heart, was gone. And in his place stood someone she never thought she would see. A man who was finally ready to let go of everything except what truly mattered. The event ended, but Isabella didn't stay to speak to him. She slipped out before the reporters could find her, before the weight of his words could settle fully in her heart. She needed time, but Adrian wasn't done. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Adrian Sterling's emotional confession, a public apology, or a desperate plea. Power or love? The billionaire CEO's stunning speech shakes the business world. The internet was ablaze with speculation, but Adrian ignored it. None of it mattered, because he hadn't done it for the press. He had done it for her, and he wasn't finished proving it yet. Adrian sat in his office, staring at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched before him, endless and bright, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was standing in the dark. He had taken the first step, admitting his mistakes. But words weren't enough. He needed action, something undeniable. For years, Sterling Enterprises had been his entire life. He had sacrificed friendships, love, and even his own happiness to build it. But what was the point of winning a kingdom if it meant ruling it alone? Isabella had been right all along, and now he had to prove he was finally ready to listen. There was only one way. A move so drastic, so irreversible, that it would show the world, that he had changed. He picked up his phone and made the call. "Get the board together," he said. "I have an announcement to make." The conference room was filled with murmurs as the Sterling Enterprises board members gathered. No one knew why Adrian had called this emergency meeting, but considering the recent headlines, speculation ran wild. "Maybe he's stepping down," one whispered. "Not a chance," another scoffed. "He just won back control. Why would he give it up?" Adrian entered, his face unreadable. The room fell silent as he took his seat at the head of the table. "I won't waste your time," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Effective immediately, I am relinquishing my position as CEO." Gasps filled the room. "What? You can't be serious." Adrian held up a hand, silencing the protests. "I have spent my entire life believing power was the most important thing," he continued. "That belief cost me more than I can ever explain, and I refuse to make the same mistake again." The board members exchanged stunned glances. "You fought so hard to take back the company," one of them said, "and now you're just giving it up?" Adrian nodded. "Sterling Enterprises will be left in capable hands," he said. "I've already chosen a successor who will act in the best interest of the company. But as for me, I have something far more important to fight for." The whispers returned, but Adrian didn't care. This wasn't about them. It was about her. The news spread like wildfire. Adrian Sterling resigns as CEO. Billionaire steps down for love. Isabella Carter's influence, the real reason behind Sterling's shocking decision. For the first time, Adrian didn't care what the world thought. There was only one person whose opinion mattered. Isabella stared at her phone, rereading the article for the third time. Adrian Sterling stepping down? It didn't make sense. He had fought tooth and nail to keep that company. He had sacrificed everything for it. And now, he was walking away? Because of her? No, it couldn't be. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't just another business move. This was personal. He was proving something. To her. To himself. She paced her living room, heart pounding. He had already made his speech. He had already admitted his mistakes. And now, he had done the unthinkable, given up the very thing that once defined him. She wanted to believe it was real. But was it too late? A knock at the door made her jump. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she opened it. And there he was. Adrian. No tailored suit. No arrogance. Just a man who had lost everything. Except hope. "Ah," he said softly. She crossed her arms. "So it's true." He nodded. A step down. A heavy silence stretched between them. "Why?" she finally asked. Adrian let out a slow breath. "Because I realized that none of it mattered. Not without you." Her heart clenched. "You can't just give up your company for me," she said. "That's not how this works." "I didn't do it for you," he admitted. "I did it for me. Because I spent my whole life chasing something that I thought would make me whole. But I was wrong. And I needed to prove to myself that I could walk away. That I could be something more than just Sterling Enterprises." She swallowed hard. "You hurt me, Adrian." "I know. His voice was thick with regret. And I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I had to show you that I've changed. Not with words, with actions. She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception. But there was none. Just raw, unguarded honesty. For the first time since she had walked away, she saw it. He meant it. He really meant it. Her walls wavered. But she had been hurt before, and she wasn't ready to fall again. I need time, she whispered. Adrian nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. Take all the time you need, he said. I'll wait. And for the first time, he meant that too. Days passed, then a week, then two. Adrian didn't push, didn't call, didn't chase her. He simply waited. And slowly, Isabella realized something. For the first time, Adrian Sterling had let go of control. And maybe, just maybe, that meant he truly had changed. One evening, she picked up her phone. Her fingers hovered over his name. Then, with a deep breath, she called. It rang once, twice. Then, Isabella. Her heart skipped. She swallowed. Hi. Silence stretched between them. Then she took a deep breath. Can we talk? They met at the park, neutral ground. No business, no power games. Just them. As they sat on the bench, Adrian looked at her, waiting. She met his gaze. You really gave it all up? He nodded. And you don't regret it? A small smile tugged at his lips. Not for a second. She studied him. The arrogance was gone. The need to win, to dominate, gone. In its place was something softer. Something real. I spent a long time thinking about us, she admitted. About everything we went through. He exhaled slowly. And she bit her lip. I was scared. He frowned. Of me? She shook her head. Of believing you. Of hoping. His throat tightened. And now? She hesitated. Then finally she smiled. I think. I'm ready to hope again. Adrian's breath caught. Are you saying? She laughed softly. I'm saying that maybe, just maybe, we can start over. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. Not a victory smile. Not a businessman's smirk. Just happiness. Pure, simple happiness. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. And in that moment, they both knew. This time, they were finally getting it right. The world watched in shock as Adrian Sterling walked away from his empire. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the world. Because he had something better. Something real. A love that had survived. A love that had changed him. And as he walked hand in hand with Isabella, he realized this was the only success that ever truly mattered.